So now moving along in our discussion of Plato's Republic, we reach books 6 and 7, which are going to largely revolve around his epistemology and ontological views, which are going to overlap in such a way that they're bound together, really. And so book 6 starts really with the continuation of the arguments that Socrates is going to try to make in defense of the city and the rule of the philosopher king. And largely this is revolving around the practicality of it. And we left off where Plato implies that, the way this world is in time and space is a problem itself that gets us away from Plato's theory, really. And essentially this is the idea that reality has an antagonism to this world of ideals, of forms. And Plato is saying if there's these, two separate sort of entities here, one of ideals and then one of images of the sort of imperfect world that isn't geometrically perfect at all times, if you will, and has repetition and these callbacks, if you will, of imperfections that we see in front of us that are related to these ideals. So he wants us to direct to that adverse world, to the world of perfection, and not pay so much attention to what we are just perceiving in the shadows and the images that go day to day, or even as much to say as the bodily, because of course Plato is a philosopher of the soul. So we can't trust those bodily perceptions necessarily. In other words, truth and, most importantly, justice exist outside of the temporal world, in a real world, away from what is incomplete, or the illusion or the perceiving of those images. And now this goes into the discussion really in book 6 of, who is the philosopher king and what is he kind of made of, if you will. And really, if we examine the term philosopher king, it's laden with a lot of irony here, because it is the only position within this city of justice that has, two positions in the name. And, when we were talking earlier in the books about, a man having a sort of telos of an ambition that must be satisfied, a calling, if you will, and Plato wants them to do well at it, so you should take up your time on that task at hand for the harmony of the city in your soul. Whereas the philosopher king, you'll notice in the labeling of these two names, must have a rigorous and really love of the truth and who they are to, go through the rigor of a dialectic education, really, and to take up the mantle of being the king. And of course, such a city and such a regime has never taken place before. No regime has followed the wisdom man. There's many different Homeric sorts of kings and their sorts of archetypes, if you will, of what Plato now considers the silver, the courageous statesman, if you will, and that in his contemporary time is considered, that's a good king. Whereas, Socrates wants to have us living in a world where the man with wisdom on his side, and this isn't to diminish that he also must have courage. Of course, I would consider Socrates a very courageous man. We can't forget, and sometimes it's easy to slide over this because there are certain characters and the way they are and what they represent, but let's not forget that we also need to have a bit of courage of all of the virtues, really, to have harmony in a soul in the city. Socrates, though, isn't just trying to refute and defend we should be under the rule of the philosopher king, But he's also trying to not only convince you of this argument for an ideal world, he also needs to convince these philosophers that they themselves see them as kings and actually stand up to the task of wanting such a responsibility. And, the responsibility really is not only to be an adequate philosopher, but to then use that knowledge, to use that towards ruling your city, and all that comes with that. And if not, such a task is going to lead what Socrates considers the real corruption, which is Athens itself. For it is the city that brings the people down, and the philosopher is who can help guide them back up to get them onto the path of knowledge. And now I wanted to kind of take a detour here to notice how, when we started this entire discussion on Plato many months ago, that we were moving from the mythic structure that the likes of Jean Gebser talked about to this rationalist structure. And this is, of course, embodied in his example with the Greeks here, although there is other examples. So that's an interesting aside, I would say, when the likes of the Demos of Athens or Socrates' own account for it, and how, yes, new conscious structures such as the rationalist conscious structure that is taking hold as we go along this journey here through Plato, nonetheless, there are still inferences, and within these two books here are some of the most famous accounts of myth, really, that we have with regards to the cave, or even earlier with the myth of the Gyges. So they're still being invoked. Myth still has power, or at least some sort of reasoning behind why they would quote such a thing, despite the fact that they are doing it for different purposes now, even denigrating them to some degree, we could say. But I do want to point out that relationship to get back to, one of the reasons why we are doing this to begin with. And so he turns to the sophists and says that, these are really symptoms. The people who are, perpetuating the demos of Athens, if you will, many of them have actually good souls, but they nonetheless have a bad education, a sort of bad environment. And really the failures of not having either a proper philosophy or having that really as the telos for your political project. I always found this to be a fascinating explanation for, why we see, especially with activism in the 21st century, how, many times, despite their horrific acts, or in some cases even good, there is still the examples of good activism out there. But think about this, many times they're willing to go to great lengths to get their message out, whether it is for the good or the bad, and you're harming people. Nonetheless, there is a sort of, we can't really ignore the fact that, a lot of these times these require a lot of brave ways of going about this, whether it is good or evil, which, is a hard thing to say, really. But I think here with Plato, he's talking about how, there are good souls out there. And Thrasymachus kind of stands in as an example of this because, he's, in many regards, what you would want, actually, in someone within Athens. And so he kind of becomes a tragic figure in some sense because, he's a total tyrant, or at least advocates for such tyranny. And he's an example of really that bad education. And I think you see that a lot with, a lot of the activism we've seen where, maybe there are good souls out there that you might disagree with, but their ideology might not be up to snuff to, be a part of the good, if we're going to, fully look into this from a Platonic lens here. Good soul with a bad education is very dangerous. because they go to such extremes, which is the case with Thrasymachus in the example here. And I think that is still true to this day and will probably always be true, really. So with that, we see that the sophist really is simply a symptom of the greater disease here. Whatever the city logic, whatever the form that it takes, if you will, the sophist is simply going to do what it needs to get by in such a system. So it's going to conform. You can't trust them to be able to actually make real change, if you will, in such a city or a situation. And really, this is to say that corruption is really the greater symptom of the disease of ignorance that's plaguing a city or plaguing a people. And knowledge is your key out of it. But, what, as he continues, is the difference really between what a philosopher king is going to be as compared to the guardians or even the bronze, if you will. And what makes up such a person? What do they have that no one else is going to really have? And this is, of course, through the understanding, or really the connection, the desire even, to have knowledge of the good as the form of it itself. And to, unpack that, if you will. It is to know what is knowable without a temporal or a spatial imprint. It is to know that other world out there that Plato wants us to get to, or at least to try our best to be a part of that. In other words, the philosopher king is going to be in tune with the goodness in the world, which all other good things in the world are articulated out of. And so we end Book 6 with the look at the famous divided line. And so these are his epistemological doctrines of what is the universe really made of? What is our perception of it? And what does that really mean in the realm of knowledge? And so to go from the bottom up, we start with the least real, which for Plato is the shadow image, such as the image of you, the shadow that you cast behind the sunshine, or the shadow. And, that shadow that's behind you is less real than me actually standing there in front of you. And so in that sense, the images, then the representations, are the least form of the real compared to objects if we're going to ascend up. His other examples of images are, of course, in the arts, like painting and sculpture and the creation of images, because these are just representations. And I think that's a key insight if you want to know why Plato has famously such an antagonism towards poets, because their scale of knowledge is so lowly for Plato in that sense. Images are reflections and are less real than the objects that we actually observe in space and time. And just as an aside on poetry, poetry and the arts really bring about a sort of mental process of picturing and it's imagination, really. And such an activity is very dangerous, I would think Plato would say, because it's an activity of the soul. And if Plato is our soul doctor, then what could elicit such a response with the arts is going to be very dangerous to Plato if not handled properly. So continuing up the line now, we're ascending. We go to the objects of sense perception, which Plato famously finds very untrusting, because of course in his contemporary science, the basis of knowledge always ran the gambit of running into mistaken perceptions. Think of the mirage, and objects, how we perceive them has an uncertainty to it, and Plato wants absolute certainty. He thinks that is what is unchanging, is real knowledge. You can't just subject your way out of real knowledge, or just have a couple of different variations in the sort of scheme of object perceptions, if you will, to what is actually grounded, to what makes this knowledgeable. But nonetheless, we do know that there is consistency with a lot of way we perceive objects. There's the window right there, and as long as I keep it closed, it's going to stay closed. It's always going to bring in this sunlight. But for Plato, that's a belief. I don't have absolute certainty that the sun might stop shining through this window, even though it's been consistent. It's still just a belief. And such a gap, really, of objects perceived and how we can't have certainty really shows the gap that we see where space and time demonstrates to what is the actual ideals, what is the ideal republic. And so we don't have an adequate, you could say, way of actually fully fulfilling these ideals, because space and time can be so untrusting. And such a world is, well, wrong for Plato. And so he's trying to show us that we can have an alternative, though, that this everyday world might not be sufficient enough to create those ideals that we have, that we want. And so he's trying to get us to focus away from those day-to-day images and objects as they flee, as opinion and belief really go through transformations, because of course their perceptions are transforming. And so to neatly sort of give us sort of crossing from, as we go from perceptions of objects and a discussion about that, or the images and representations even below that, he synthesizes these two ways together and calls them opinion, really, and not really of the realm of knowledge. And we can be misguided by this everyday emergence that keeps us from what is real outside of space and time. But what is that bridge? What can we do about this sort of gap that keeps us away from our theory here that we want to bring about in this world? And Plato turns to mathematics. And as we ascend up the line now, mathematics for Plato is a sort of firming of going beyond simply just belief or subjectivity, and that's how we get out of opinion. Mathematics is real knowledge. Triangles and numbers and the relationships between variables of these mathematic systems have qualities that must be true for all triangles, and it is what is true and unchanging. And you can't just subjectify your way out of something being a triangle, or the sum total, if you will, of all of the angles. Insight here into mathematics and how objective it can be is really the key, I would say, to how he's going to jump this across for politics and ethics, really. Because mathematics have definitions that are necessary to describe something like a triangle, and then he's going to leapfrog that with mathematics to say that we need to have such definitions of what is unchanging in our ethical lives and our political landscape. And he wants to really take that definition, or try to find a hard evidence definition with regards to justice, and what then qualifies for justice to have every instantiation of justice to obtain enough evidence of it being a variation of justice, but it is the only idea of justice that makes it unique to any other entity out there. So then a good Platonist would say that mathematical concepts and objects really are us leaping up the divided line to really enter the realm of knowledge. Triangles and squares don't change, and to be able to have such a doctrine to demonstrably prove that such a thing requires precise analysis and really a grasping of definitions of such things. There's no subjectivity to the Pythagorean theorem and what a right triangle is. And so once we get something like the theory of the right triangle, it stays with us forever. It's knowledge that isn't going to change for any of our grandchildren, and it wasn't knowledge that changed for any of our great ancestors. It was always true. Knowledge then is fixed, and it is not a becoming. It is the divine that does not change, really. And mathematics is that bridge to bring about the realm of the forms and to leave beyond these day-to-day perceptions. This is the realm now where permanent and real knowledge with the use of mathematical objects are really the most accessible way that Plato has to kind of demonstrate that there is this world out there that is outside of space and time, that is true without these conditions. And with that, you have something like the concept of square rooting a negative integer. You can't show that in space and time, and it can't be applied to physical appearance. And we have no correspondence to this in the physical world, and that shows for Plato just like, hey, the fact that we can't have this, even though it is true, there's a gap between our world and that of the truth. And Plato is going to simply throw the gambit down and ask, what world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in this world of perfection and ideals, the realm of the forms, or the flawed, and where true reality is just the becoming and appearance? Now, incidentally, I think this discussion about math here shows why I think the likes of Oswald Spengler and just something that I've observed in my own personal life, that if someone's really good at math, they can usually be a pretty formidable philosopher, because they're able to think with that sort of analysis of and really they seem to have a leg up on logos compared to everyone else around them that doesn't really take math seriously or just doesn't have the knack for it. And I think that's an interesting aside here, because Plato is saying a good education is going to require a lot of math, actually, because that is how we get to hard knowledge. And it's interesting to see that one of the most important aspects that's actually more overlooked, I would say, than anything in the humanities nowadays is the use of mathematics, and how important it is. If you want to have knowledge about the world, then you probably are going to need to have an understanding or some sort of grasping of these mathematical truths that are out there, if you want to be a truth sayer of reality, if you will. And with that brings us to the top category of the divided line, which is the realm of the forms. And form is usually interpreted to be idea, or at least translated to the entity from which all examples out of it exude in this world. This is a classic example of what form really means, and that would be with books, because it's easy to see how they have different shapes, they're different sizes, they have, of course, totally different words or even entire languages written within them, but yet they're all under this homogeneous set of being referred to as a book. They all have the similarities of, or enough qualities to be considered a book, despite the fact that they're totally different, and they share this sort of category. Something like a water bottle, there's totally different variations, brands, sizes, even the quality of the water or its source, if you will, and yet they all share the same homogeneous set or linguistic term of being a water bottle. Language is the bringing together of these different particular instantiations, such as varying books or water bottles, an object or thing, and creates this theme out of them, creates it into a set. How do they have all of this shared similarity despite the fact that they're totally different things that are perceived? An abstract concept like a square, if I drew a square for you and I have horrible penmanship, it's going to be completely flawed. It'll have, totally miscalculated lines to what, a perfectly angular square would look like. And that square in its perfection is brought down below to us, even though it doesn't have perfect angularity, because Plato would probably posit that we live in a flawed reality that doesn't have perfect angular sides to something, and instead it's imperfection. But these particular instantiations, such as the square, refer back to that perfection, to the form of the idea of that perfect angular square. And so regardless of what type of people in space and time the concepts or the rules of what they know about squaredness, if you will, those were always true. It doesn't matter about their subjectivity. It doesn't matter who they really were. It matters that this is a concept that's always been true. And there's a consistency to that through the generations, because of course true knowledge never leaves us. Geometry doesn't leave us. And this is, again, another way of looking at how we get to the realm of the forms in its truest form, and we recreate it through space and time to gesture ultimately at those perfect ideals out there. And with that, he's expanding upon the what he considered to be his airtight argument with how objective mathematical truths are through space and time, and saying that we can do this with our political projects, to saying that we can do this with aesthetics, with beauty, that these are also things that are always true, and there's a perfect instantiation of it out there, even though we don't necessarily have access to it in the real world. We have callbacks to it, imperfect perceptions that contain a little bit of that within it. And that example could be best with the arts, really, because of course you have completely different styles within the arts, like something like painting, and you can have two paintings that are have totally separate meanings. They're completely different in how we observe it, but yet Plato says they are participants in the form of the ultimate beauty outside of space and time. And that's how two totally different objects on the surface are summed together under the same rubric of what is beautiful. And this is another jump of Plato to say that the philosopher is the one who knows this, who understands this on such a level that they know their ontology, or that they have access to the logos of being instead of becoming. The philosopher gains knowledge about the logos of being by using the method of the dialect, which is a rigorous conversation with other participants to find out the truth about matters at hand. And such a discussion is not of opinion or the world of flux and change. These are matters of real knowledge. And we can recount here that at the beginning of the book we saw that the ideal city cannot be actualized. There's no practicality to it. And Plato is reversing this and challenging us that because reality is flawed and corrupted, but the theory that we do have from Plato here is true reality. And just because it doesn't necessarily overlap completely over reality doesn't mean that we should abandon this project for the ideal city, is what Plato's really trying to get at for us. And so Plato wants to further contextualize this with the most famous and high point, really, of Platonic philosophy, and that is with the myth of the cave, to kind of further demonstrate for us what he's, in a practical way of, going along the divided line. And so Socrates asks us in a sort of thought exercise to imagine, for us to think of, what the bottom of the cave, there are inhabitants, and then there is, of course, an opening at the front of the cave, and everyone within the cave has their head and neck restricted to only see the wall, and there's a large fire behind them, and then there's also these men who they cannot see that are carrying things, objects, if you will, and those objects and images are cast onto that wall that the people are restricted to just seeing. And those shadows that are being cast, despite the fact they can't see the people behind them, those shadows are what they consider reality. And this is a mistakenness, of course, of ontology. If you do not understand the true knowledge of the forms, or Platonic philosophy, then you are much like the prisoner who is shackled to watching those images and claiming that that's their reality. And through the dialectic, we talk about such matters and really go on this journey that Plato talks about a lot. It's the journey to ascend the line to true knowledge, or the realm of the sun. And the sun represents true reality. It is the form of the good that makes everything that is good possible. It generates, it's the one object that generates life and goodness all around it. And Plato is asking us to go on that journey, to see at least a glimpse of the sun and the goodness. And, it is implied here that, seeing such goodness, it is so beautiful that it can't just be contained within language. You can't just express it fully. And this rather beautifully is asked by Glaucon. He wants to see this goodness. He wants to be a part of it. And Socrates says that if I could take you, I would. Because, we have to go on this journey to ascend the line and see the light of day. With that, we see all the way at the beginning of the book, and you'll notice that, a lot of this almost, in a way, becomes kind of repetitive because there's so much symbolism and really the way it's written, to how, these themes just continue to pop back up in this text and really all of Plato's philosophy. And we see really kind of a callback to how, Socrates is apprehensive about going down the line to, going to the city, but he needs it. He has to. It's part of his goodness. The virtues and goodness tied to wisdom and knowledge requires a confrontation against the city's ignorance. And so he is tasked really to go back down the line to the realm of the shadows. And when he's doing that, he's mocked in a lot of ways, because he can't really see. He's unable to navigate this flawed world. The sun, in its goodness, in a way, is almost so bright that now he can't even navigate the shadow world below him. And this goes back to what I mentioned a couple videos ago about, with the relationship to the sun, and how we can see, a theology developing here with Platonism, and that we should, worship and curate goodness of the forms. And, it's interesting that Plato, of course, is trying to remodel Greek history and tradition, and even religion in that sense, because many of the Homerics, of course, were greatly flawed people, but a form, perfection of an archetype, if you will, is devoid of that sort of personality that many of the myths that he had such contention with earlier. Now, when it comes to curating a philosopher king, their education, of course, has to be different because, of course, they need to have a dialectical education. But largely, it starts out the same. The philosopher king is, one of his own. He's not totally alienated, and certainly having that relationship would mean, he does participate in coming down to be able to somewhat besmirch himself to be a part of this world. And Socrates has a sort of reluctancy, really, because of course he knows he's going to get killed probably in the end. And that the education, of course, is through mathematics, through the curation of a body, and serves as a sort of bridge for the soul to real knowledge. And then from about 30, the philosopher, or the trained to be philosopher king, he splinters off from the rest, from the warrior class, and he's trained on the dialectic until he reaches a sufficient stage for actually being able to apply this theory, or rigorous conversations that he's had to unveil truth to him, to actually embody it in practical politics in his midlife. And by this point, one can be a king if he has cultivated his soul towards understanding knowledge of the good and a love of it, and to make decisions in this framework instead of the sophist alternative, or the tyrant who is just serving one's appetite, which of course will create a bad education around him. We must have order in our souls, and to have order in the city with a harmony. And if we don't have that, we'll have a splintering. And if we have a disjunction then in the soul, we will also have injustice in our city. And that's going to lead us to then Plato's discussion of the regimes and our relationship to the sort of regimes we're ruled under. And I hope you guys stick around and like this video, and I'll see you guys for that discussion as well.